Lord, we turn again to the Holy Scriptures, wherein we remember the oldest stories of your faithful. May we listen to them attentively, hear them dutifully, and struggle with them faithfully, so that we may with your grace unravel the wisdom they contain. Amen. Our reading for today is a fun one. This is the beauty of following the lectionaries. There's all kinds of wacky readings that we get to dig into. So, I haven't significantly modified this one. I just added a little tacked on a couple extra verses just to finish the thought process. But we are going to be looking at Genesis 29, 13 through 29. So, when Laban heard the news about his sister's son Jacob, he ran to meet him. He embraced him and kissed him and brought him to the house. Jacob told Laban all these things, and Laban said to him, "Surely you are my bone and my flesh," and he stayed with him a month. Then Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be?" Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were lovely, and Rachel was graceful and beautiful. Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than I should give her to any other man. Stay with me." So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days, because of the love he had for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, that I may go into her, for my time is completed." So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. But in the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her maid. When morning came, it was Leah, and Jacob said to Laban, "What is this that you have done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?" Laban said, "This is not done in our country, giving the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also in return for serving me another 7 years." Jacob did so and completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel as a wife. Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her maid.
Poor Jacob. I mean, we've all been there, right? Right? You wake up in the morning and realize you accidentally married the wrong cousin. These are his cousins, by the way. This is his mother's brother's daughters. And somehow, after the wedding, he didn't realize until the next day it was the wrong. That's an interesting story, is it not? We're going to have a whole sermon about it today. Isn't that exciting? So, Jacob ultimately, it isn't super clear there, but ends up with 4 wives, right? So he has Leah and Rachel, and then Zilpah and Bilhah, the 2 given as maids, he also has children with. They're just secondary wives for him. So he ends up with 4 wives and 13 named children at least in here eventually through those 4. Big family. Jacob, by the way, is the guy who shortly after this gets renamed Israel. And then, if you're a fan of musicals, you may remember Jacob has a son named Joseph in Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, right? This is his dad. This is Joseph's dad. Okay. This is Abraham's grandson. Marriage is a very different institution in the past. I was talking to a coworker whose son is getting married here in about a year. She's like, "We're just kind of looking for stuff. What are some good verses or stories about marriage from the Bible to have in the wedding?" And I go, "I can give you a lot of really bad ones to read at the wedding if you want." And so we're going to go through some of the suggestions that I gave her today, just as a pitch for why we should be very careful when we read a lot of these historical stories about how different the world may be. So Abraham, we'll start with Abraham. There's plenty that could be said before that, but we're just going to start with Abraham so we don't have the entire scope here. Abraham has a wife, right? Sarah. Sarah is his half-sister. I don't know if anybody ever caught on that, but it says in his story at one point that Sarah is actually his half-sister. And then her maid, Hagar, he also has a child with, which is sort of a secondary thing. Abraham's nephew, Lot, right? Lot travels out from Haran with him into the Promised Land. He's the one in Sodom, and then his wife gets turned to salt, that wife. Well, then, if you read the story a little further, and this part is not anywhere in the lectionary I'm going to throw out there. So if you're waiting to hear this story on a Sunday morning, Lot ends up having children with both of his daughters. All right? Then we go down to Isaac, Abraham's second son. And Isaac marries I'm in the wrong spot on my list. Isaac marries Rebekah, who's his second cousin, his dad's brother's son's daughter. At least that's the one that's named, okay? We're on a roll here, all right? We got lots of half-sisters and cousins and stuff. Esau, Jacob's brother, so we got Jacob here. Jacob's brother Esau has 3 wives. 2, Judith and Basemeth, are Hittites from a neighboring group. And when they upset his parents, he then marries Mahalath, who is his cousin. And they're much happier about that one. All right. Judah, one of Jacob's children, right? So of the multitude of children that Jacob has with his 4 wives here, Judah ends up marrying Shua and has 3 sons with her. And then after 2 of his sons dies, he ends up marrying his daughter-in-law Tamar, one of his son's wives. So we got some fun there. Skipping ahead a little bit, Moses has at least 2, right? The one that's named and we hear about a lot is Zipporah. And then at one point he just mysteriously sends her home, and it says he marries a Cushite woman who is not named. But Aaron and Miriam are very unhappy about this for some reason. Elkanah, jumping ahead a little bit further now. So Elkanah is the father of Samuel. Samuel's a prophet. We get a couple books of Samuel, right? Elkanah has 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Saul, the first king, is listed as having 2. David, Saul's successor, David, the man after God's own heart, right? We hear that. David, the lineage of Jesus, make a big deal. He has 8 that are named, and a 9th that is referenced, but is not specifically named with him, although the guess is, so he has Michal, Saul's daughter. He ends up, after Saul dies, taking both of Saul's wives. So that's Ahinoam and Rizpah. He has Abigail, whose husband he kills and then marries her, because, he's the king and can do that. Maacah, Haggith, Abital, Eglah, and then famously Bathsheba, whose husband he also has murdered so that he can marry her. Okay? All right, so that's David. All right? Isn't this thrilling? All right. David's son Solomon, one of his youngest sons, is traditionally listed as having 700 wives and 300 concubines. So that is quite the household right there, all right? That's a busy place. Now, we skip ahead a little bit. Josiah, who leads a lot of religious reforms, he's listed as having 2. Hosea, the prophet. Now, not just kings, okay, we go to a prophet. Hosea marries a prostitute and has several children with, they don't have DNA tests, so it's kind of hard to verify that. But he gets to name 3 of their children, at least. Okay. And then there's like a quick overview of the Old Testament marriages, right? I don't feel like I'm missing too many. There's a lot of unnamed people and whatnot, but but it's a fun time, apparently. A lot of relatives. So the New Testament fixes this, right? This is where we get to a much more familiar vision of things. Well, in 1 Corinthians, Paul makes it very clear that none of us should ever get married, if at all possible. The best way for everyone to be is single for their whole lives so they can focus all of their energy on ministry and serving God and taking care of people. But he gives the concession that if you really can't handle that, I guess it's okay to get married, because it's better to do that than have a lot of other problems. So Paul's position is just don't do it if you can possibly avoid it. In 1 Timothy, there's this famous reference to deacons as a requirement for deacons. There's only a handful of titles used in the early church. Deacons are one of the lower major titles in the church. And the rules for deacons is they have to have only one wife. Okay? And translations render it slightly differently, but I promise you in the Greek, it just specifies they can only have one wife. It doesn't say at a time or something like that. It just says one wife, implying that they could hypothetically have more. And then there's all kinds of kind of interesting like side issues that it could address in the New Testament. Like in Acts 8, there's an Ethiopian eunuch who becomes one of the first converts to Christianity. And eunuchs don't have family. They can't have children at all. They can't have families. Traditionally, they aren't married. So there's kind of that whole Paul's sidestepping idea of the concept of marriage. We have the woman at the well that Jesus talks to in John, right? Who's had 5 husbands so far and is working towards the 6th, it says, which Jesus doesn't really seem to per se have a problem with. At least he doesn't say anything about it specifically. But, you know, just as a note, largely the move towards what we would now call a nuclear family comes from Greek and Roman philosophical traditions. Because in Greek and Roman law, typically, it would be a husband and a wife, and then, you know, all the slaves in the household were kind of fair game for everybody. And there really wasn't any expectation of fidelity on the part of the husband, at least. So there were brothels everywhere in the Roman Empire, and that was just okay, you know? It wasn't until 673 AD, so less than 15 centuries ago, that the church officially declared that it would only marry 1 or 2 people as a couple. You could only have one spouse as of 673 AD. That's when the multiple marriages thing, that's when that kind of went downhill. That's when that became illegal, at least within the church officially. And between the 8th and 10th centuries, it kind of varies by place and time, they eventually get rules that forbid marriages to close relations, so no more cousins, all right? That's out somewhere about 1,000 years ago. And it required the bride to consent to the marriage for the first time, somewhere between the 8th and 10th centuries. Before that, it was just, well, this is what your dad wants you to do, so I guess you're doing it. And then they set the age of consent at the ages of 12 or 14, depending on time and place and gender and a few things. So you might have to wait until you're 14 to get married. 25 in most places without parental consent. So, all right. So that brings us to about 1,000 years ago. I still feel like we're just at that point starting to look like the way we think about marriage in kind of a modern context. And that's just 1,000 years ago. So this kind of normative idea of a couple and their children, of a nuclear family, very new by biblical standards, and pretty unusual. You get things, Deuteronomy in chapter 21 assumes men are going to have multiple wives at least concurrently, because it talks about favoring one's children over the other. And there's rules about it. Now, I don't bring this up in isolation. The point is, everything is more complicated than we ever want it to be, right? Whenever you want to ask, how should it be? Well, where are we looking? Are we looking to Jesus as the example? Well, he doesn't get married that we know of, at least. That seems to fit with Paul's version. And the Shakers tried that in early American history. I don't know who's a big fan of American history, but there was this group called the Shakers, kind of tangential to the Quakers, and they said, nope, we're not getting married, we're not having children. And there's not any of them around anymore. I'm just going to throw that out there. Not a popular group. Do we look to David, right? The man after God's own heart? Well, if you're willing to have a household of 10 adults, some of whom may possibly, I might have skipped this, but remember David married Saul's daughter and then married Saul's wives, which means he's married to his own wife's mother as well, okay? So do we look at David as a good example of marriage as an institution? Do we go back to Jacob, right? Israel, the origin of the 12 tribes, the name Israel. Still got 4, at least. Where you want to look and when you want to look to try to establish what is the ideal model makes a big difference. And this isn't the only topic I can do this week. Throw out any concept, and whenever we want to say, what is the idealized form of this, I can almost guarantee you the answer changes over time. Because as much as we can be assured, as often as we are assured that God does not change, the world does. And while we have rules and laws and expectations, those change over time, right? Jesus upends a lot of stuff from the Old Testament because the world changes, and ultimately, if we are to believe Jesus, then what matters is not the specific versions of any of those rules. All of those rules, the law, is a tool meant to achieve a purpose. And what we are called to in Jesus and called to through the Spirit is trying to figure out, trying to understand those intentions, those purposes, those ideals, those values, and figuring out ways to try and live that out. This is what we talk about, the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law, right? So there is no set pattern to conform to on almost any topic you want. On violence, right? Old Testament, there is so much warfare. And then the prophets come through and say, but a time's coming when we won't have to fight anymore, right? We'll bend our spears into pruning hooks and all that. And then Jesus comes along and says, nope, no fighting anybody. Turn the other cheek, walk the extra mile. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And we kind of backtracked on some of that. Early church was aggressively pacifist. The topic changes over time because the world changes. So how do we live out the ideals and values? I with my coworker who's asking about marriage readings, I brought up that the most popular one, I guarantee any of you who have ever been to a wedding have heard 1 Corinthians chapter 13, right? Right? Yea, though I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am only a sounding brass or clanging cymbal. And if I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. Right? Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it is not rude. 1 Corinthians 13, the most popular wedding reading ever, that has nothing to do with marriage. It doesn't. That is how we are supposed to care about everybody. That is the love we are supposed to have for all of our brothers and sisters, biological and not. All of our neighbors. There's nothing wrong with having that at a wedding, but when we try to limit it to that context, there's no expectation in any of these that you have any particular feelings for your spouse. Marriage was an institution of family lineages and economics, and that was about it. We are not trapped in that world and in that system. I hope any of you that have gotten married at some point in your life did so because you actually liked the person you got married to, at least at the time, right? I'm hoping most of you voluntarily married that person, right? I know that there's definitely some shotgun weddings that's slapping out there, right? I get that, but most of us actually get to think about this in advance and pick someone that we want to be with. That is 100 years old, tops, right? That concept is new. I think that's wonderful. I think that's a great way to do things, that we shouldn't be stuck married to the same person as one of our parents and our sister and possibly a half-sister, right? Like I think this idea is great, but that's new, and that's okay. We are not stuck by these, because even in this book, the expectations change over time. The Old Testament, all these rulers, multiple wives and concubines. New Testament, there's not a lot of the apostles that have multiple spouses, right? Peter, we know for sure, is married. Of the 12, he's the only one that we have specifically listed because it talks about his mother-in-law at one point. Don't have one of those unless you're married. Whether or not you want them after you're married, that's a separate issue entirely. But, so we know Peter was married. We don't know about the rest. So clearly, there is a change in expectations there. A couple hundred years later, the church says, nope, always only one partner. That's 640 years after Jesus' death. They changed to that definition. We are not trapped by any particular definitions or understandings. We aren't given this whole book. I have ragged on this a lot, on all kinds of different topics and all kinds of different readings. You cannot pick one line out of here and say that's how we have to do it. Because there are 50 lines in here that talk about how we do everything. And they are not the same over time. The 10 Commandments are listed twice, and they're different, okay? And if they couldn't keep the 10 things the same, between give or take a couple hundred years probably of writing them, we don't have to keep everything exactly the same. The Spirit will lead us in truth. We aren't living 3,000 years ago, we're living today. God has a greater imagination for this world than for it to stick the way it was at any one point. And our job, our opportunity, our joyous mission is therefore to try and seek where God's imagination is leading us in all things and work with God to bring a kingdom that looks the way that God's imagination can make it be. This isn't about any particular topic. The reading gave us a fun, easy one. Fun. A weird, easy one. I like weird stuff. But anytime you're considering what does the Bible say to do, whenever you want to run to this as a manual, and I'm not saying don't, consider all the possibilities therein, and then consider that God has moved on from that as well through the Spirit, through the church, through the living body of Christ in the world, to new imagination and new possibilities. None of this was written before 1177 BCE. That's the Bronze Age collapse. The earliest chunks of writing we have in here are potentially written in Ugaritic, which died out within a few years of 1177 BCE, which means there's 11, not even 1,200 years between the oldest parts of the Old Testament and Jesus, and there's 2,000 years between Jesus and us. How much changed between Abraham and Jesus? We've had significantly longer. God is not trapped in the past. God is a living God who leads us into a living future. We're called to be part of that. whatever that looks like. So, be prepared to struggle with topics. I love that the reading today was about Jacob. Jacob's name gets changed to Israel. I've talked about that particular reading where God changes his name. Why does God change Jacob's name? Because Jacob wrestles with God, gets in a literal fist fight with God by himself, and wins. That's the story that comes up shortly after. Look it up. It is beautiful. Jacob wrestles with God and is given the name strives with God or wrestles with God. That's what Israel means. And that is the name of the people that God chooses. Those who are willing to struggle alongside God, figuring out how to make all this work. Be prepared for a struggle. That's how it's supposed to be. I wish it were easier too. Amen.